I'll be talking about building applications with Xamarin, so I hope that is why you all came tonight. First, a little bit about, is it moving, switching? All right, a little bit about me. So I'm Jan Van de Poel. You can find me on Twitter at Jan Van de Poel. I co-founded a company called Flowpilots. Once we built mobile applications for enterprise customers. I'm also a Xamarin MVP, and I host the Xamarin user group in Belgium. So from September on out, we'll be doing a monthly session on Xamarin. And in my spare time, I'm trying to pick up running and cycling again. So what I'll be talking about today is Xamarin. Now, when most people talk about Xamarin, they usually talk about the Xamarin platform, meaning how you can develop mobile applications. Now, the main part of the talk will be about the development part, but I'll also show you the tools that Xamarin provides to do building, testing, deployment, and monitoring of your applications. So, the development part. So if you today build mobile applications, there's a number of choices that you have to make. But the first question is what the users expect when you create a mobile application. Well, first off, they expect to be using the native UI. So they expect the application to work on the platform that they're using. If you're using an Android application, you expect there to be no back button, because on Android phones the back button is default in the hardware. But for iOS, you expect there to be a back button so that you can navigate back between the different views. Users expect to have all the features from the platform. So if you have the GPS or battery or light sensor or whatever, people expect to use that in your application. And then thirdly, people expect to have the native performance. So if people open an app, it just needs to work. If it doesn't, then people will very fast switch or move to another application. Now, if you build an application, there's three possibilities or three choices that you have to make. The first approach is what's called the siloed approach, and is basically you use the tools from the platform vendor. So if you build for iOS, you use Xcode and you use Objective-C or Swift to build your iOS application. On Android, you use Android Studio and Java, and on Windows, you can use Visual Studio with C#. Now, the pros of using this solution is that you have all the latest and greatest from every platform. If iOS 11 gets released by Apple, you immediately have Xcode 9 to build the application using the machine learning framework and ARKit when it gets released. Now, one of the downsides of using this approach is that if you're building an app for iOS, Android, and or Windows, then you have to build the app entirely for every platform. So if you decide to start with an Android application and you want to build the iOS version, there's absolutely no code reuse between those two. If somewhere along the line you change something in your API, then you have to change your iOS and your Android application, recompile and resubmit them both. Now, the second approach is what's called the write once, run anywhere approach. Basically, this is using HTML, JavaScript, and CSS to either build a web application or build a hybrid application, which is basically a native application that has a web browser where you run the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Now, the plus side is that it's very easy to get started with. I think most developers know HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, or it's very easy to get started with. Now, the downside of this is obviously that you have no native performance and that you don't have all the capabilities of the platform. Third way is the Xamarin approach, where you get to use C# to develop on the three platforms. Now, if there's one key takeaway that you take from this talk, is that what Xamarin does on the development side is it provides a C# wrapper for all the native APIs of each platform. Meaning that it allows you to develop in C#, but using the same APIs as you do in Xcode or in Android and Java. So a UI view controller, so the view screen on iOS, is a UI view controller in Xamarin. It's just so that you can use C#. Now, because you can use C# on all the platforms, you can reuse a big chunk of your code. So all the code that is not UI, meaning talking to your local database, talking to the backend, business logic, error handling, you can all just write that once and run it on both iOS, Android, and Windows. Now, on top of that, you build native UI for iOS, for Android, and for Windows. Now, I think it's 2.5 years ago, Xamarin released Xamarin Forms, and what Xamarin Forms allows you to do is also create a native UI that you can share across the different platforms. So using XAML technology, you can say, I want to specify a screen that has a list on there with a label and a button. Now, lists, labels, and buttons, they're common across all platforms. And what Xamarin Forms will do for you is translate those XAML elements to native UI elements. Now, I'm not going to talk too much about Xamarin Forms. That's something for Glenn's talk, which is after the break. I'm sorry, Glenn. Spoil your talk. Now, after Xamarin was acquired by Microsoft, obviously the story got expanded a little, that you can also write your C# in the backend, whether you deploy it on Azure or on Linux, doesn't really matter, but that you can start sharing code across the complete lifecycle of the application and then reuse both on the backend, on the front end, and then also reuse a lot of code on your mobile application. Now, how does it work? This is very simple. So Xamarin provides all the C# APIs that you would expect. So system.net, system.xml, link. You can all use those just like you would in a regular C#. And then on top, well, for Windows, obviously, that's normal. They provide you the platform-specific APIs. So the phone, networking, just as you do on the Windows application. Now for iOS, it's exactly the same story. So you have all the C# goodness, but on top of that, you can use MapKit, UIKit, all the APIs that Apple provides for iOS, you can use them from C#. Now, as far as I'm aware, at the moment, it's about 100% coverage of the API. So it's basically just a mapping of the iOS APIs and expose them in a C# interface. It's the same thing for Android. So all the .NET runtime, and then on top you have the action bar, activities, all the things that you expect from the Android API. So basically anything that you can do in Xcode programming iOS or Android Studio programming for Android, you can do using the C# APIs in Xamarin. Now, how does that work? Basically what Xamarin does, so apart from the wrapper around the APIs, it will take your .NET runtime, your C# code, and then the bindings. Quick sidestep on bindings, very short, is that if you find a component, some cool Objective-C component that you want to use in your iOS application, you can simply wrap it yourself so that you can use it from C# and then just use it in your application. So what Xamarin does for the iOS APIs, you can easily do yourself for any Objective-C that you find. And you just expose C# and then you use it from your code. So we'll take the .NET runtime, your C# code, and any bindings that you will have created, and it will just create a ahead-of-time compilation to an ARM binary that runs on iOS platforms. Now this is indistinguishable from what you would get if you would run the compilation from Xcode using the Objective-C to a binary. So it's the exact same pipeline. Now on Android, it's not ahead of time, but it's just in time. So we just compile it to an intermediary and then it gets executed at runtime. So translated at runtime to machine code because Android runs on different architectures. Now as far as I'm aware, and I've been doing Xamarin from the really early days, they have always been able to release on the same day as new SDKs gets released. So now iOS 11 beta is being developed by Apple, which is rather in public, and Xamarin is already releasing alphas that you can test to try to see if use the new APIs, see whether it works, and I expect that when iOS 11 gets released, they will same day release an update for Xamarin iOS to make sure that you're able to use all the goodness of the new platform. For Android, there's usually a little delay because Google doesn't share pre-releases of any Android new version that are coming, which is rather a shame. So sharing code. How do you go about sharing code? So I've talked about that you can have a C# backend to your mobile app where you share a lot of code between the different projects. There's 3 ways that you can share code between projects. The first, and this is the one that we started initially with a couple of years ago, is you share projects. You create a C# project where you write all the non-UI code, and then you create an iOS and an Android project, and you simply link to that project. What happens is every time you compile your application, you compile the entire shared project along with your application and then run it on the device. The advantage of this is that within your shared code you can specify, hey, if I'm on Android, do this. If I'm on iOS, do that. Now the advantage is also a disadvantage because that leads to less clean code. Yeah, well, you know the bugs that can arise from these kind of if then else on a certain platform. A second way to share code is portable classes. And portable class is basically you write C# code and you specify on which platforms you want to run it, or you want to be able to run it, and it will generate one binary. Now the problem with portable class libraries is that you have to get the smallest common denominator of the platforms you want to target, because not all platforms from .NET support the exact same APIs. The advantage of PCLs is that you have one code base that runs the exact same code on the different platforms. Now, shared projects and portable class libraries are the 2 that are more of the hopefully legacy, and then the third way in which you can share code, .NET Standard, is supposedly going to be the future. Basically, it's the correct implementation of PCL, where all the .NET runtimes, so all the different platforms, they will support the same set of APIs, and then you can just say, okay, if I'm supporting a version of .NET, I know that all these platforms will support the exact set of APIs. .NET Standard 2 is on the way, and I think in Xamarin 10.14 they will have support for .NET Standard 2, I think. Now, if you use .NET Standard and PCLs, you can easily use NuGet to share your packages. So if you have certain functionality, such as the people from JSON.NET, or you want to create a framework, or you want to create a plugin that you use in different projects, you can just publish it to NuGet, and then you can, from your IDE, just add certain packages to reuse code over a number of projects. Statistics on code sharing, and I think these are pretty old statistics given the names of the apps, but it gives you an idea. A lot of people ask me, how much code can we reuse? And the answer is always it depends. So it depends on what type of app, whether it's there's a lot of UI, there's less UI, so it depends a little bit, but the benefit is that you're using C# and that you can reuse a lot of code. Any questions so far? Okay. So the development experience, first of all, it's open source. So Xamarin iOS, Android documentation, it's all open source, and meaning you can fix bugs, but not everybody does that. But at least you get to see where they are and how things work if you might run into problems. You can find all that on open.xamarin.com. Now, if today you are using Visual Studio, you can already just start using Xamarin the way you would on any other technology. So it's just included in any Visual Studio license. Now, if you're on the Mac, we used to have Xamarin Studio, but now I think since almost a year, we have the Visual Studio for Mac, which is surprisingly good, I must admit. If you're in Visual Studio, you can, and this is cool technology, you can use the simulator just like you would on Mac. So what happens is, if you develop an iOS application on the Mac, you build it from your IDE, you run it, and then you see the iOS simulator because it's native to the platform. What Visual Studio does is it will connect to a Mac in the network, it will compile the code, and it will run the simulator and send back the results so you can interact on your Windows, so on your Visual Studio, with the simulator that is running remote on the Mac in the network. For Android, you can have, there's a designer, I put that in here. You can have a look at it in the slides after. I'm not going to talk too much about it because all the Android developers that I know just write their XML by hand. They don't use the designer. Same goes for iOS, and by that I don't mean everybody writes their own storyboards, but 99% of the developers doesn't use the designer that comes with Xamarin Studio. They use Xcode and the storyboards and the zips to define their interfaces and then sync back to Visual Studio for Mac to do their development. There's been a lot of work going on the designers, but it's just really hard to get it right, and the one from Xcode is really, really good. If you want to get started on xamarin.com/prebuild, there's a number of applications that give you an insight of how larger projects get structured. So you have a couple of examples with all the source code that you can look at and learn from. Now I think the coolest part of the presentation is the demo. So I've talked about a lot of things. Let's maximize this. Can everybody read that? Is it readable? More or less? Okay. Hold on. Whoa, hold on. Apparently, if you hold the Alt, you can switch the font. Cool. Okay, so if we open up Visual Studio for Mac, does anybody who has not used any IDE so far? Everybody's developer? Okay. So, what you'll see is if you open, and I already have a solution open, that on the right side there's a solution, and it basically contains three parts. So the image search, the Droid, and the iOS. Meaning that all the code that I write in the image search will be shared across the iOS and the Droid project. And then for Droid and iOS, I write specific code for the UI. Okay. So I am mainly an iOS developer, so I'll use that code as an example. So if you've, hold on, it works, but it's, okay. So if you're an iOS developer, the UI view controller should sound very familiar. It's the exact same way that you would create a view controller in Objective-C. You have all the lifecycle methods, so the view that loads, memory warning, I can just say override, the view will appear and implement. So all the lifecycle methods that you have in Xcode, exactly the same lifecycle methods in iOS. If here I open the storyboard, I can do it in the iOS designer, but I prefer to do it in the Xcode interface builder. So what it will do is it will open up Xcode, it will show the storyboard, I can make changes there, and then they will sync back to my Visual Studio. So I'll open the storyboard, and the story it's very simple view controller. Basically, I can type a text, there's a search button, and then there's a collection view of all the results of the search that I will do. Yeah. If I look at the view that load method, what will happen? And we'll assign the view model. We'll get to that later. On the button, there's a touch up inside. So basically, the touch handler. If I touch the button, what will happen? Well, we will disable the button. We will start the activity, so activity animator. So we'll probably say, okay, hold on, we're doing something. We'll search for the images. Once the images, the call to the backend gives us an answer, we'll reload the collection view, we'll re-enable the button, and then stop the animation. Yeah. So we'll have a look in the view model. So in the view model, what happens is we have a list of a collection of images, and then we have a search for image async method. What will that do is it will check if we are connected. If not, then it will pop up a dialog, and it will connect to the Bing image API. So basically using URL, setting some headers, and then very easily just say, okay, create a new HTTP client, await some reply from a server, deserialize it to a search result, and then the images reload all the images. Yeah. If we are to run, hold on. Yeah. So this is just the iOS simulator. Right. I'll put a breakpoint there. Yeah. So we'll search for cute monkeys. I'm not connected to the internet, so that works. Hold on, let me fix that. Sorry about that. Okay. So while I'm waiting for my, there it is. Okay. So are there any questions so far? Am I going too fast in the demo? Is there something else that you want to see that you're missing? So if I click the button, yeah, it will trigger the search for images method, and then I can basically just step through the code. Here I say, okay, give me the contents of this URL, and await the result. Okay, yesterday it worked. So apparently my API key is no longer valid, but you get the idea. So you can just use the C#, and if the API key was good, then we would have seen a number of images. So basically, if we would run the Android example, then we just use the same code. So if somewhere the API for Bing changes, or you want to switch to the Google API, we just update this code and then recompile, and then it works on all the platforms. Any questions so far? Is there anything that you want me to dive deeper into? Hold on. All right. So plugins. I discussed that we use a shared C# backend, and then we write custom UI code for every platform. Now, obviously, there's a lot of things that are similar on the three platforms. They all have a battery indicator, they all have the camera, they all have GPS notifications. Now this is all code that you'd want to reuse in your core across the three platforms. Yeah. So wouldn't it be cool if we didn't have to write those code? So what you can do using a plugin is basically you define an interface that you can use in your core code, and you can just say navigate to this position, and then at runtime the implementation will say, okay, I'm on iOS, so I will use the iOS system implementation to navigate or to open the correct navigation application to route you to your destination. Yeah? So basically, if you want to speak out or have your application read out a certain string, in your core code that you share across the platforms, you just say speak and then the string you want to read out. And then on each platform, it will use the correct implementation for text-to-speech. There's a number of plugins you can find on the GitHub page from Xamarin. And you see if you start building real Xamarin applications that there's a lot of plugins that you are bound to be using. There's the JSON.NET plugin, there's the geolocator, there's the connectivity plugin. So there's a lot of code that you can already use using a NuGet and just pull it into your project and save yourself a lot of time. Now, a big part of your application obviously is development, but there's also a lot of stuff that happens after development. One of the things is testing your application. And I know, being developers, that we don't like to write the tests, but if you have an app in production, you're going to want to have unit test, integration tests, and on mobile also UI tests. Now why? Because there's a number of challenges. There's a lot and a lot and a lot of devices. And if you ever put out an app in production, it's impossible to test all the configurations. You can test a few, devices, you can test a few OS versions, but it's impossible to test all the apps on all different possible combinations. The idea is that once you have an app, that you release on a frequent cycle, because people expect bug fixes, they expect new features, and you can't test it all. Now on mobile, this is extremely hard. For the reason I mentioned, there's a lot of versions, OSs, devices, different sizes of screens. For instance, this is an image of all the different form factors for Android. I don't know when this was taken, but I think it has only become more complex over time. So it's impossible to do this by hand. Also, everybody just said, yeah, we just need an app. Now, an app is a complete software project. It's probably sometimes even harder than just a desktop application. There's a lot of things happening in iOS and Android. You always, or 99% of the time, you're communicating with the backend. So there's a lot of things that can change and that can go wrong. And if you need to monitor all those and do this by hand, it's virtually impossible. There's a lot of interactions by users with your app. So they can pinch, they can zoom, they can swipe, they can push, they can long press. The point of all these 4 slides is that there's too much combinations for you to test. Now, what Xamarin allows you to do is, in C# write very simple scenarios to say, okay, we'll start the app, wait until the login screen is there. On the username, fill in this email, fill in this password, click here, and then we should go over to, I don't know, the list of tweets that I sent out today, for example. You can then run these tests on your simulator or on any device that you attach to your machine. Now, it gets better. There's also a test recorder, both on Mac and Windows. Basically, you run your application and you just click through it. So instead of writing all the C# code, you click through the recorder, fill in the fields, and then the C# gets generated, so that you do exactly the scenario that you would have hoped. Works the same on Mac. And then Xamarin provides what is called Test Cloud. And what does that mean? Is they have a lab somewhere where they have literally, I think it's about 3,000 or 4,000 devices hooked up to the network, where you can say, okay, these scenarios for this app, I want to run on iOS 10, iOS 10.1, iOS 10.3, and then you get the results. So this will automate your complete UI testing, which is really cool. There's a lot more to say about this, but make sure, just so you know, it's out there. Now, with the acquisition by Microsoft, obviously there's a lot of Microsoft tools that can easily be integrated. So Visual Studio Team Services will allow you to share code, plan your work, do automated builds. So every time you commit and you push some changes, you have automated builds where you hopefully include also your tests, and then release. So So basically, plan your work. This is like Jira or any other software planning, but it integrates nicely with the whole solution. Yeah, maybe a little bit too slides on that one. Whoa. Okay. Yeah. I don't know why I'm having this, but apparently for the last few days, my PowerPoint has systematically been crashing on me. So apologies for that. Not sure why it does it. Hold on. Right. Now, once your app is built and tested, you need to get it to your users. Microsoft acquired Hockey app, which allows you to easily distribute applications to beta users. So if people can test your app, you want to make sure you can do the quality before you put it into the App Store. And the one on the right is Xamarin Insights, where basically if your app crashes in the field, people will not call you. People will not tell you this has happened, using these and these steps, and then it crashed. If they do, you're very lucky, but 99% of the users just said probably will never open your app again. So what Insights does is if the app crashes, they will give you the last steps that the user did and send the stack trace so that you can analyze how much time or how many times this bug has appeared, what was the user doing when it happened. So remember, Hockey app for distribution and Test Cloud for testing. Now, if you look at the right part for testing, building, distributing, and monitoring, Microsoft has been working on one solution to integrate all of these. It's pretty cool and it works actually pretty great. You can find it on mobile.azure.com, where you basically can build your apps, follow your crash logs, and all you have to do is just point it to your repository. It will automatically build it for you, detect what type of project it is. So be sure to have a look. Now, if you want to get started with Xamarin, you can go to xamarin.com, obviously, but there's also Xamarin University, where they teach you how to build Xamarin applications over time. You can also get certified and get some hands-on experience, and also sessions with real-life people that help you with your problems. So I hope this was a first introduction to you for Xamarin. Are there any questions?
Do you have some experience with the Xamarin University, with the courses? How much time it takes to get certified?
I think Sam is the best one to answer that one. I personally, to be honest, I haven't done Xamarin University. I've been doing Xamarin since there was no university. It was just
because I wanted to do it, because like 83 euros a month or so for subscription.
Sam, how long does it take?
If you're spending every day on it, you can complete it in about 3 weeks.
3 weeks.
If you do about 3 sessions a week, it will take about 2 months.
Okay.
Because I have a lot of contacts from Android, iOS, some performance, Azure. Depends on what you want to learn. If you want to get certified, you have to follow the Xamarin forms courses. If you just want to learn about Xamarin, you can just check the ones.
Okay, so any other?
The Xamarin Insights, so how is it built, or is it built?
What do you mean?
Like on a mobile subscription, like application Insights, is there a cost connected to it?
Yes, but I don't know it by heart. I need to look it up. I thought you were asking for the technical, but I don't know what it costs. But there is a cost associated.
But basically, it was still kind of like application Insights kind of a system.
Yeah. So basically, if your app crashes, then it sends a stack trace environments to the backend, and then aggregates those results. So you can see how many times a bug appeared, when was the last time, and you can contact the users that had that if they're logged in.
So would you recommend Visual Studio as your IDE on Mac? Or I heard that Xamarin themselves have an IDE.
And so there's historically there's Xamarin Studio, and then I think since about a year it's Visual Studio, and since I think since 3 weeks when I got back from holiday, I switched to Visual Studio and have not looked back.
Okay.
If there's no more questions, then I suggest we take a break now. But if there's still, oh sorry, I didn't see.
Oh, sorry. It support on the interface different languages on this developing by using Xamarin. That means there are different national languages. So.
Could you repeat the question? Is it different languages of the IDE, of different languages of the application?
I don't mean that the computer language. I mean.
Sorry,
I don't mean computer language. I mean language, the interface, because I came from Africa. So, when you develop kind of these systems, you have to use that with the nations, not only English, French.
No. So okay, I got the question. So basically, what you can do is there's a number of things that you can do. iOS and Android support localization of your app, so that you can detect which app, which language the device is in, and then you can provide the translations for that language. What we do if we build an app is default in the core. We use English as a default, and then we specify all the languages that we want to use, so that you input the translations, and then we just propagate them to each platform. So the translation is not necessarily a feature from Xamarin. It's something that you can add in your code fairly easily. So in Belgium we have the same problem. We speak English, French, Dutch, and maybe a little bit of German. Okay, if you have any other questions after, I'll still be here for the remainder of the evening.
Just to follow up on that last question, do you mean to say that Xamarin doesn't have native localization support?
What I'm saying is, from the stack, I don't think it's Xamarin's responsibility to provide the localization. So iOS has perfect localization, Android has localization, but what we do is, because we share code on different platforms, we provide it in the core. So that all the strings that we use, all the labels, is just a string in the core, and we decide, depending on which language we detect or which language the user selects, that we just provide that language. So it's functionality that you should foresee, but it's not Xamarin's responsibility to build that.
And is there a framework you use for that, or is it?
There's one good one is Vernacular. I think it's one of the best. To do specific translations. They have for languages with multiple or different plurals. They support that, I think we have, I don't know, we use another one, but I don't know it by heart. But it's basically just grabbing a label from a JSON file. Okay, then I think we will have a break.
Then we'll start. Thank you very much for attending. Like Jan already mentioned, this evening is all about Xamarin. So it's about cross-application development, cross-platform application development. But I will only be focusing on Xamarin Forms. All right. So it's one of the possibilities of how you want to create applications with Xamarin, and Xamarin Forms is one of them. All right, so who am I? This is me. You can reach me on Twitter. That's the best thing to do. If needed, you can email me also, but first contact me through Twitter. That's always the easiest. I will respond fastest. I'm also a Xamarin MVP, like Jan, but I'm also a Microsoft Development MVP, meaning I actually started with mobile development through Microsoft. I was a Windows Phone developer, but I needed to switch because Windows Phone is no longer existing. So I needed to do something else. Well, I became a Xamarin MVP. Okay. This is actually the same thing that Jan already mentioned. Xamarin Forms exists because we want to build native applications for each mobile applications for each platform. So for Android, iOS, or Windows, Windows is still a target. You can use Xamarin Forms. But what is now the difference between those two? So on the left-hand side is everything what Jan was already telling you. We have a shared backend in C# code, so a backend meaning shared code for your mobile application, but you still needed to do your own UI in each platform. So storyboards on iOS, funky XAML on Android, XML, and regular XAML on Windows. Now, a lot of developing companies like that very much because they could create good-looking applications with this, but not everyone was familiar with all the UI specifics for each platform. Meaning, if you're a development company and your main focus was iOS, it was difficult for you yourself to do Android because you needed to learn everything about the UI yourself. So, or you needed to hire an Android specialist to do that. So a lot of companies came back to Xamarin and told them, yeah, isn't there an option for us that you guys do something with the platform so that if we already know one of the three, that we also get the other two available. And that's what they did. So Xamarin Forms came about because they also wanted to have a shared UI so that if you do your UI once, you will get it on each platform. So that's the old philosophy about Xamarin Forms, to have a shared common UI for all three platforms. So what do we get? We get some sort of API, and that API can be used in code, but also for Xamarin Forms there's a XAML language. So meaning you can create your UI declaratively through XAML. So that's very neat. So if you already are a WPF developer or a UWP developer or a Silverlight, if somebody did that once, Silverlight developer, that means that you will be able to cross over to Xamarin very fast because the XAML is almost the same, right? There are some tiny bits that are changing, that are not the same, but it doesn't matter. If you know XAML, you can switch very easily. And do note that even though you are declaring it in XAML for the tree, Xamarin Forms will, for you, regenerate that into native UI. Okay? So you're not losing any native functionality. There is just an extra layer in between that will do the rendering for you. And for Xamarin Forms, there are renderers, so they created renderers for each UI element. So by doing this, and you see that on the drawing, you will now be able to have in your shared project also UI and your backend. Backend meaning your mobile backend. Now, what does this allow? It allows you to do a very rapid development because, okay, you just need to do your UI once. In general, when you do this for a good clean project, you will notice that even though you only need to declare your UI once, you still will be tweaking some small detailed things on each OS if needed, and that's possible. So because Xamarin Forms is just an abstraction, it means that you can still, if you want to, get to the native code. So, like, if you're a developer like Jan, and you're doing the Xamarin standard approach, all that knowledge isn't lost. If needed, you can use that in Xamarin Forms also. And because of Xamarin Forms, you will now get a native look and feel for each OS that you target. Because Xamarin Forms, the people of Xamarin, what they did do is if you put a button inside of your XAML, your UI that you declare, they will render that button like how a button will look in iOS and how a button will look in Android and how a button will look in Windows. Do note that currently Xamarin Forms only targets C#. There is talk of F#, if I'm not mistaken, but I don't know, it's still in preview, I think. But for the moment, everything needs to be done in C#, so there is no VB.NET. Like I already mentioned, if needed, you can hook into the Xamarin Forms rendering system. So if you use your XAML, it will render a button, for example, and you still don't like how that button looks and feels on iOS, and you want to tweak it a little bit, you can hook into the way how the Xamarin Form renders that button and adjust it if needed. So that's done with custom renderers or effects. Like Jan also already mentioned, is the shared part, so your shared knowledge and now also your shared UI will be placed inside a shared project or a PCL. But for the moment there is work being done to also allow .NET Standard 2.0 class library, so that's the newer way to go forward. I can't demo that because if you want to do that you need to run a preview of Visual Studio for Mac, because I'm on my development machine I don't want to do that and I have not enough memory anymore for other virtual machines. But it's coming, all right? With the next release of Visual Studio for Mac you will have, the tools will also be available to .NET Standard 2.0. Xamarin Forms consists of around 40 plus pages, layouts and controls. Like I already mentioned, you can code it by hand, your UI, but all those controls are also available in XAML. But Xamarin Forms is not only UI, it's also been built from the ground up with MVVM in mind, meaning you already have a messaging center, you also have the possibility to use a dependency service, there is also a navigation available and two-way data binding, for example. And there's also an animation API if you want to do fancy stuff. So there is more abstraction in Xamarin Forms being done than only the UI, right? And that's neat, because then you can create applications very easily and fast. These are some designs of all the layouts that are available in Xamarin Forms. So the master detail is like with the hamburger control, that you have a slide out menu from the left. The navigation is, like the word says, is how you can go from one page to another page. There's also a layout. And all the layouts that you see here can be nested. So, meaning you can have, for example, a grid layout inside the navigation or a grid layout inside the tabbed layout. Okay? So you can mix and match. There's no problem. What else is there in Xamarin Forms are the different UI views. The UI views are actually the controls. And this is all the hard work that Xamarin did for you. Meaning, if you put a button in Xamarin Forms, Xamarin will detect that you want a button, will look up the button renderer in their code, and will spit out the native code to render a button in iOS, or the native code to render a button in Android or in Windows. But you can also create your own controls, custom controls if needed. And this is the actual code that you're going to write. So if you want this layout in Xamarin Forms, then you see at the right-hand side what XAML you want to have to type to get this. So if you look at it, you will see that we're using a tabbed page. The tabbed page, even though we have only one UI declared in XAML, you will notice that a tabbed page in iOS, you will have the icons on the bottom. In Android and in Windows, you'll have the words on the top. So Xamarin Forms looked at each OS and they looked at each design language that is available for each OS and said, okay, a tabbed page needs to look like this on Android or on iOS or on Windows. And they did all the hard work for you. But now with the newer design guidelines for Android, you probably also want to switch this to the bottom, because now with the new material design, you're also going for a top tabbed bar. That means that you need to hook into the renderer and adjust something to be able to switch that. Okay, so it is possible, but the standard way of rendering is at the top for the moment. Also, everything that has been done with Xamarin Forms has been made open source. So this is the link. Now, I think I've put it open on the website. So Xamarin Forms itself, because it's just an abstraction on top of Xamarin, is just code. And all the code is available in this GitHub repo. So if you want, and you find bugs, you can become a contributor. I think there were 70 contributors when this slide was made, but if you look now, you will see that there are 77 contributors for the moment already. So the nice thing is that if you find bugs inside any of the renderers, or if you think, no, Xamarin did a mistake here, a button is not gray in iOS, but it needs to be black. That's just an example. You can submit pull requests and try to get it added in Xamarin Forms. So you will notice that a lot of people already did some work inside of this. Stefan de Vogelaar, a colleague of Samuel, is also somewhere in here. So there are some Belgians already in this list. So it's quite funny. So this is my contribution. I'm also on the list. So I found some bug in Android, and I fixed it. So it's fairly easy. If you take a little bit of time to go through the code and you find an actual bug, you can do a pull request and actually have code inside, your code running inside of Xamarin Forms. All right, that's for the contributions. Another good URL to know is the one on top, is the XF roadmap URL, because all the things that Xamarin is willing to do for the future, they will try to lay out in a roadmap. And all those features are now available on that website, and you can also submit your own. So if you say, okay, we're missing this still in Xamarin Forms, and I want to have this added, you can submit a roadmap feature, and then everybody will discuss this, and the people from Xamarin will see if they will add it or not. So it's with a voting system, I think. So, and it's with a discussion. So there are also at the moment of creating this slide, there were 37 evolution proposals already on that site, but I'm guessing it will be far more at the moment. Now, for the demo, but first, before I go to the demo, because there was a question in the other talk, if you do Xamarin Forms and you want to do multi-language, there is a toolkit available from Microsoft itself, and it's called the Multi-Language App Toolkit. It's actually something that was already available for UWP and WPF, if I'm not mistaken. It works with regex files. It's something very known. And they also ported this now to Xamarin Forms. So even on Xamarin, the URL, I don't know it by heart, it samples Xamarin's Forms to do localized. You get a complete introduction on how, if you create a Xamarin Forms application, how you can use multi-app language toolkit to fully create a multilingual app. So everything is working with regex files, and the toolkit will automatically build and compile the needed files that are necessary during running your application to switch from language. So the only thing that you need to do is select a language. You get a UI representation of all the keywords that are in your application. You just need to translate it, and it will build the necessary files to run. So that's very neat. But that's only available in Forms. So why Jan will probably not be using this. And also currently it only works in Visual Studio on Windows with the IDE integration. They're busy doing Visual Studio for Mac integration, but I'm not sure when that will be available. So, all right, back to the demo. So, if you're on a Mac or you're running Visual Studio on Windows and you do File Your Project, you'll have the opportunity to choose a Forms application. On the Mac, with the latest updates, you'll have two types. In the beginning there was only one, blank app, but now you have two. The blank app will give you just the startup page, but if you choose the Forms application, you will already have some examples on what you can do with a Forms application. So let's use that one, Xamarin Forms demo. I'll target Android and iOS. You will see nothing else. Because I'm running on a Mac, I can't build Windows. So if you also want to target Windows, you need to be developing on Windows. And then you get Windows also as a selection. Do note that if you're running on Windows, you still need a Mac to build your application. So to compile your application. Okay? But you can do everything in Visual Studio for Windows. Only if you want to run your simulator, you still need a build host, and your build host will be a Mac. Can be a Mac Mini, can be a Mac in the cloud, can be a portable, doesn't matter, but it needs to be a Mac. Where we'll put it, okay, that's fine. Create. Et voilà. No, needs to load the NuGet packages. Okay, so what's now a little bit different than Jan's approach? The setup of the project is almost the same, meaning you have your OS-specific projects. Normally, in the other approach, you will do a lot of code still in these ones, if needed. But for Forms, you almost won't touch those two. All your code will be done in the shared project. In this instance, it's a PCL, but like I said, in the future there will be a .NET Standard 2.0 class library. And what do we get extra? We also now have the possibility to create UIs inside of our shared project. Typical, if you create an MVVM, if you use MVVM for creating your objects, you will separate everything in views, view models, and models, meaning that the views are all available in this area. And if we look at one view, we'll take the items page as just a list of items. Oh, font is still very small. Let's adjust that. Fonts. Oh, I can zoom in also, I guess. No. Yeah, all right. That's good. Maybe a little bit too big, but okay. This is an actual layout, a UI layout. And what do we see here? We just see a regular content page, meaning just a blank page. And inside this, there's a stack layout. Stack layout is something that you can arrange elements inside of it in a vertical or in a horizontal way. There's a stack layout, there's only one element in here for the moment, and it's a list here, meaning we just will iterate and show several items in a list. Now, something fairly recently added in Xamarin is the ability to have a preview of this UI. So, in the beginning, when we had Xamarin Forms, we didn't even have a preview. So each time if you adjusted something in your UI, you needed to run the application before it will work. And even though we have it, it will sometimes crash. So I think, if I'm not mistaken, I need to build it first time. Let's rebuild it. That's building. I will talk a little bit about the XAML also. And what we'll see here is, if you're familiar with XAML, we have data binding. So with brackets, and you use the binding keyword and say which fields you want to use from your view model. So meaning this items page is normally bound with a view model called also items view model. So there is public property items, and if you look at the page, that property is used through MVVM to fill our list view. So we need to fill that property in our view model, and thanks to UI data binding, our list view will pick that up and render those elements. All right, let's try again if the previewer will work. And the project has been compiled. Yes, I compile it. Okay. Let's run it then. Oh, that's big. So this is our application. What did we create? We created also, again, a tabbed page. So with 2 tabs. The simulator is just a little bit too big. So I need to adjust to 50. This is not, okay, still visible, quite visible. And in the first tab, there's that items page rendered inside of it. And as we can see, the list view already contains 6 elements. So it's a regular list view. That was not what I wanted to do. Okay, this is. All right, that's better. And if we tap on an item, we go to a detailed page. So that's the other page that is available in our project. There's an item detail page. For the moment, there's not a lot in it. Also, again, a stack layout and just 2 labels. And labels meaning text that we display on the screen. So that's this screen, all right? But what we actually do now is if you tap on one item in the list, we do an actual navigation. And that's only possible because of the fact that the main page is also inside of the navigation page. And we can see this here. So the main page, the shell for our application, was a tabbed page with the 2 icons at the bottom on iOS. On Android, it will render the 2 text elements at the top. And the 2 other pages, there's an items page and an items page. There's the browse element, and an about page. There's this page with a little bit of information, are contained inside of a navigation page. And a navigation page is something that Xamarin Forms already provides you. You don't have to write that yourself. And if you use that, what can you do then? In your C#, you can use items view model. Where's the command? I'm not seeing it. Here it is. Okay. So on item select in the list view, so if we tap on an element in the list view, we can now use the navigation class to navigate to the detail page. And also that navigation class is something that Xamarin Forms provides you. So you don't have to write all the code to actually do the real navigation on each platform. Because this is an abstraction, of course. Even though you want to navigate from page A to B, it's very different if you need to do that in Xamarin iOS or in Xamarin Android. Because in Android you need to do, help me, how is it called in Android? Activities. Yeah. Like I say, I don't know the specifics from the other platforms because I'm a Xamarin Forms developer. But in Forms, it's very easy. You just write navigation.pushAsync, and your navigation will work on each operating system. So that's very easy. Is there anything else I need to tell you? Yeah, maybe just touch a little bit on the operating projects themselves. So how this whole works is you select which operating system you are targeting. In this case, we're doing iOS, so the simulator for iOS is started. And the first thing that gets activated is the main.cs file. And the only thing that's being done for you is there's already one line of code added to kickstart the Xamarin Forms project. So in iOS, it means you have a UI application, main, and you run that. And in Android, this means in the main activity, there's a Xamarin Forms initialization, and then we load the application new app. And that app class is the one that's residing inside of you, in this case, portable class library. So the actual Xamarin Forms shell that gets loaded. But all that code to start it is already added when you select a project in Xamarin Forms. And if you need to dive deeper into any of the renderers that Xamarin Forms did, you also need to add some custom code inside one of those projects. All right. I will not demo that for the moment, but it's not that hard. So let's get back. So now, what are we going to expect for the future? One of the neat things that is coming is that you will also be able to embed Xamarin Forms pages inside of the Xamarin native apps. So if you have a project already in Xamarin iOS, but you have some shared page that's already designed in a Xamarin Forms application and you want to use that, you will be able to embed that inside of your Xamarin iOS project if needed. So the link is also provided on the PowerPoint, and you'll see the result. So this your places weather is a Xamarin Forms UI element, and that's being loaded in Xamarin iOS or in Xamarin Android or in a UWP application. So if you have already written something in Xamarin Forms and you want to use that in the other types, it's also possible. The other way around is also possible. So if you have some fairly exotic custom iOS control, that's only created in Xcode, you can also hook that up in Xamarin Forms, but do note that it will also only render in iOS, of course. Okay, so you need to do something on the other platforms if you want to have to mimic that control. But if you have a custom control written for iOS, you can use it in Xamarin Forms also. So the other way around is also possible. Like I already said, it's very difficult for an Xamarin Forms developer to see what the output is for your UI. Like I tried already to use the previewer, but the previewer sometimes crashes, so that's not very good. We'll try one more time to see if we get something. Right. All right, so now we get an OS. Okay, this one doesn't say much, maybe the about page. All right, so, okay. We already see what's being rendered from our XAML. But do note it's fairly new, so in the beginning we didn't even have that. And now, even if we want to try some stuff out, we still need to run our application. So what did the guys from Xamarin say? No, the new way of work will be using the live player. Also for that you need to run a preview, but there's a neat GIF available on the website. So the live player, how does it work? The first time you start it up in your project, you will get a QR code. You need to download a special application on your device, and with that application you can sync, connect the two, your project with your device, and after that you can select that device as a live run, meaning that the XAML that's being that's being rendered or is visible in your project will automatically appear on your device, even without compiling or running your application. So a little bit like how the web guys work. So you can do inline CSS or JavaScript editing, and in your browser you will see the results straight away. With the live player, that will also be available. So if you hook that both up, it will constantly monitor your XAML file, and if you change something, it will, like they do now, they change the name, You see, your live player will re-render it without running or compiling. So that's one of the newer features I'm very keen to try to use, but like I said, it's currently still in the preview. Okay, and that's actually the end of my presentation. So, are there any Xamarin Forms questions? Or did everybody understand what it is now and how you can use it? It's not that difficult, it's just an abstraction above the others, but for me, like, I was a UWP developer, I knew my XAML already. It made my life very easy to cross over to Xamarin. I still don't need to know everything about activities and storyboards, so I can leave that all behind and still create applications. Yeah.
There's not a GUI editor yet for putting some things on the form and get a slight arrangement and then fine-tune it in example?
No.
Because I don't know every example syntax by heart, but maybe it's not.
No. So like the things that you are familiar with, like in the old days with Visual Studio, with that you get a control box and you just drag and drop, that's not available for Xamarin. No, you need to know all the XAML. Yeah. But okay, if you follow the university or if you follow the docs, you will see what controls are available. For each control, you have an example XAML on how you need to use it and what properties are available. But there is IntelliSense, of course, for your XAML. So as soon as you start typing, you will see the properties come up. But you still need to know that a button is a buttoning XAML and a list2 is a list2. So still need to know that. Anything else?
You told about the future. There was also one thing that I think is very important is that Xamarin Forms will target other frameworks also, like now they target iOS and Android, but they will support like Tizen from Samsung.
Yeah.
So I think that will also become more and more.
So for the moment, because of the fact that we are already targeting UWP, you can also create Xamarin Forms application for HoloLens or for IoT devices. And indeed, Tizen is a Java platform, if I'm not mistaken, for televisions, and that's also now ported for C# and .NET. So also for that, you'll be able to create applications. Even for the smartwatches, you can create Xamarin Forms applications. So there is no limit actually. Xamarin Forms is just a UI wrapper, so in the future they probably will target other. There's also a preview branch now available to create Linux applications with Xamarin Forms also. So that's also nice. So
what about desktop Mac and Windows applications?
For Mac, there's also already a preview built on. So that you can try out, but not all controls are yet ported for Xamarin Mac. Okay, but you can already try to do and create a Xamarin Forms application for the Mac instead of iPad or iPhone. Yeah. But also that is still a work in progress. I thought that would be already finished, but it takes. It's already busy for 2 years, I guess. So it takes some time, it seems.
Where do you draw the line between Xamarin Forms or doing native IFL?
Yeah, that's not. It becomes less and less apparent. In the beginning, it was very easy because if you had to do a lot of animation, a lot of tweaking for each operating system, it was set, and it's still a little bit so that try to use the native UIs because you will get very fast results and very good results. Because of the fact that Xamarin Forms tries to mimic, tries to form your XAML into something they want on your UI, it could be that what it's rendered is not what you intended to have, so you still need to tweak that. So the difference to do the custom UI or to do the XAML and then tweak it again, you have to see how many time you have to spend inside of it. But for us, like in the company I work for, we were all WPF developers, so if we needed to learn everything about Xcode and storyboards, it would take us too much time, so we shifted to forms and we were very up and running. And then if we wanted to get something in the UI tweaked, we read about it or we got a consultant, and then we were very fast and agile to work with that. So it depends a little bit on who starts with it, what's your background, and how intensive or how native you want your UI to look and feel. Also for our company, I work at a bank, so we have a brand, like our bank has a brand. So we wanted to have our app look the same on iOS and on Android. So Forms was for us the best solution. All right. So yeah, go.
Can you recommend some persons to follow in Xamarin, like some MVPs like you and or other MVPs?
That's actually a good question. There is a Xamarin MVP list. So all the Xamarin MVPs are on one side, sorry. And most of the Twitter handlers are mentioned here, so that's one thing. But there is also a community work on GitHub, and it's called Xamarin Planet. Xamarin Planet, and that's actually open for everybody. So if you think you're a good Xamarin developer and you blog or you write stuff about Xamarin, and you say, oh, I want other people to already also know this, you can add yourself as an author inside of this, and then the RSS feed and the Twitter will auto repost what those people posted. So I don't have an RSS reader on here, so I can't see this, but also you'll see, oh, look, I'm first. It auto-generates the order, so it's just coincidence that I'm first in a moment. But you will notice that most of the MVPs are already on the air, because we knew about it, but there are already other people that are not yet MVP, but like Robin Manuel Thiel, he's a Microsoft guy working for the Xamarin Stack, so like that. And you find the websites or also Twitter handles on here. And if you follow the RSS feed, you will get all posts that the people do. So that's actually the best way to write it. Okay, and that concludes my talk and demo. I hope you enjoyed it, but if there are still questions, I'm still around for a few moments. Okay, thank you. Oh.
We zullen misschien ook nog eventjes Jan bedanken voor de presentaties om dit Xamarin te komen doen. Zullen we jullie nog...